Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jay Marsden. We are back with another episode of Where There's a Will, There's a Way. And for those of you who are paying attention, you probably may have noticed that since our last episode, I have actually been able to find my way to a barbershop, which has recently opened up during the phase 3 part of this whole pandemic. So I was actually get to clean my act up a little bit so I don't look like an extra on the Castaway. So I appreciate everybody. If you are paying attention, I appreciate you paying attention. And I hope in the middle of all this craziness, everybody's being safe and everybody's supporting everybody as best they can. So thank you very much for watching and tuning in today. A couple things I wanted to talk about today. Last time we talked about the idea of probate while you're alive and what happens, were something to happen to you and you were to need help while you're still with us. Obviously, if something happens, you become incapacitated. The second part of the second show, we talked about something happens to you, how your assets pass and the difference between a will and a trust. And what I wanted to talk about was a slightly more complicated, but we're going to make it as simple as possible, conversation around the difference between revocable trusts and irrevocable trusts. Now, before you turn off the TV, because we're getting into that irrevocable trust world, we're going to break this down to its simplest form so that you understand the difference. It's actually easier to differentiate than you might imagine. Everybody lets it get a little, they get a little bit squeamish around this issue, but we can break it down for you and make it very, very simple. And the reason for that is we've had a lot of folks who have come into the office recently to ask about not only the difference between the two of them, or how to use them and why to use them. And obviously with everything that's been going on lately, everybody's got a little bit more focus on planning. And so the idea is that we want to try to make it as simple to understand the differences between the two of them and how you might be able to use them. And this way you can kind of come into it a little bit more educated. So if you do sit down with somebody and talk about this, you have a little bit of background, a little bit of working knowledge. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the idea or the concept of the revocable trust. Now, when we talk about a revocable trust for somebody, what you want to remember, what you want to think about is the revocable trust is for assets or for things that you want to retain control of, okay? Your revocable trust is basically designed to hold things that you want to continue to use and you might need at some point down the road as part of your planning, whether it's for estate planning or for retirement planning purposes. But these are the assets that you want to make sure that if you want to do something with them, sell them, use them, consume them, spend them, that you can go ahead and do that. So just as the name implies, it's revocable, so you can change it. And the key to keep in mind with the difference between a revocable and an irrevocable trust is it's all about control. And in a revocable trust, as long as you can be, you are in control. You're still in charge of what happens with anything that's inside of your revocable trust. And the best way to remember or to think about how a revocable trust would work, the way we explain it is to tell people, we just take the wishes that would normally go inside your will to my kids, to my nieces, to my nephews, whatever your wishes are, and we just put those inside your trust. That's it. That's what your revocable trust does. It tells the world, if I'm not around, if something happens to me, what's going to happen to my assets? And what makes it different is that if you think about IRAs, 401ks, annuities, things that have life insurance, things that have named beneficiaries, it's very clear if something happens to you, to the rest of the world, we know what's supposed to happen to that. Everybody understands the concept of being the beneficiary of an IRA. Somebody set up an IRA, they have retirement money in it, and if something happens to that person, be it a parent or a sibling or anything like that, we all know that for the most part, on that IRA, there's a piece of paper that says, if something happens to the owner of this IRA, this is where this money goes. The money goes to these beneficiaries in these percentages. Well, your revocable trust works the same exact way, but it just applies to different assets. It applies to taxable assets. It applies to real estate. But essentially, it's the same concept. You've set up a document, you've set up an instrument that says, if I'm not around and my trust has bank accounts, retirement, money from Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, Merrill Lynch, real estate, if my trust holds those things, there's a piece of paper that says, if I'm not around, this is where I want that stuff to go, okay? So that's the key. It works very much like the mechanism that's in your IRA. It has a predetermined outcome of where this money's supposed to go, but the beauty of it is you are still in control of everything. Now, we would still recommend that you have a will, but all your will would say is leave everything to my trust. That's it. And the reason for that is your trust is a private document. Nobody gets to see what the information is. Nobody gets to see what the rules are of your trust. If you make it, it's a private document. So all your will says is if I'm not around, give everything to my trust, and here's who my executor is. And that's all the will says. Nobody else finds out any business. Because remember, your will is a public document. If that goes into the probate court, anybody can wander in off the street, go start requesting probate files, look through somebody's will and see what your wishes look like. So the idea is keep everything in your revocable trust so that it stays private and you stay in control of it. Now, while you're able to, you wear three hats. You're the maker of the trust or the grantor of the trust. You're the trustee, which means you're in charge. And while you're alive, you're the beneficiary of the trust. All the decisions that get made with respect to that trust, you are in control of until you either cannot be in control of them or until you decide to not be in control of them. But again, remember, this is about control. So if you're collecting up your assets and you're concerned about probate and you want to make sure that your assets go as cleanly as they can from you to your heirs, the revocable trust is the way to go. It allows you to use the assets while you're alive, consume them if you want to do that. It allows you to control where they go, and even you can put in any types of rules that say, if I'm not around, don't give those assets out to somebody right away. You build in maybe a step system where they get some money at the age of 25, they get some money at the age of 30. It allows you to sort of control things from the grave, if you will, if that's what you want to do, or if there's a need for that. And then the other thing is that it can allow for things that you may not have thought about. So for example, if something happens to a family member or a loved one and they predecease, you can set a system in place that says, if I'm not around and something happens to anybody that I would leave money to, here's where I want it to go, right? So you can really kind of have the idea of your assets following the bloodline, which is what everybody likes, the idea of making sure that the money stays in the family and doesn't get involved in any future contest around divorce or other issues. So again, the idea is to take your money that would normally go through your will, hold it in your trust, and then if something ever happens to you, your trustees, who have a very similar job as the executor, they now have a blueprint of what you want to have with those assets. And it's mechanically, it's as simple as going, for example, down to the bank and saying to the bank, this person was with us, they're no longer with us, here's the death certificate that says they're not with us. We're now the trustees, and they put these new trustees, they put them on the account, now they control the assets, and their job is to essentially distribute those assets exactly as you have already outlined the wishes for. And you can make changes to your trust at any time. You can change the trustees. You can change distribution schemes. The trust is very, very flexible. In some cases, we tell people it can be almost too flexible because the ideas of what you can do with it are almost limitless. You can really set up depending on your particular situation, you can really set up a scheme that's very, very particular to your situation. The challenge, of course, is the more particular you get, the more open to interpretation sometimes your suggestions could be. So we try to tell people, think about the situation in a broad macro sense and try to build in some flexibility around how that might work. And then that way, if you need to make some changes down the road, you always can. But the idea is that if you're looking at your portfolio in total, you've got retirement accounts, you've got IRAs, you've got 401ks, you have life insurance. Those all come with named beneficiaries. So if something happens, those assets are going to go according to wherever you've got your beneficiary information pointed. For taxable assets, for real estate, for things like a Fidelity account that has, two names on it, it's not IRA, it's not 401k, those accounts pass according to how your trust document would indicate that those get passed. And then your will is there to catch anything that we forgot about or that never made it into the trust. And people say all the time, Jay, I'm not going to forget about money. Well, the state prints a list of abandoned property, money that people forgot about, and there's some sizable assets on there. So the idea that you won't forget, we hope you don't, but it certainly does happen. So that's what the will is there for. It's there to catch anything that might not have made it into the trust. Now, what does that mean? Make it into your trust. Well, statements that come in the mail today that might have joint names on them, that means obviously that property, that Fidelity account, that T. Rowe Price account, that bank account is held jointly. There's two names on it. If you want to put that asset in your trust, you go to the institution, the bank or the investment company, and you have them give you some paperwork that says, I need to change the name on my account, right? Much like you do if you get married, for example. You might want to change the way your name is titled on the account. When you go to a joint account, what you're going to do, or when you go to your regular investment account and you want to change it to the name of your trust, what you're going to do is you're going to say to the investment company or the bank, I want to have this account now titled in the name of my trust. They're going to give you some paperwork. You're going to fill it out. They might want some specific information about your trust. But what's going to happen is the account that came in the name today jointly, next month is going to come in the name of your trust. Marsden Family Trust, Smith Family Trust, Jones Family Trust, and it's going to have your name on it as trustee, not just in your name. That's what funding your trust means. It means going out into the world and changing the way your account is owned so to everybody else, it's clear that that account is in the name of the trust. And then as we talked about earlier, again, what's going to happen is your future trustees, if something happens, will show up at the bank, they'll knock on the door, and they'll say, hey, in my case, Jay's not around anymore. I'm the backup trustee. He's not with us. Here's his death certificate. Can you now move us up? And you'll move up. And then the trustee has the authority to do what you've outlined in your trust. And if there's a couple of beneficiaries, the trustee sits down, they write a couple of checks, and out the door your estate goes. It's very, very easy. There's always paperwork as part of these processes, as part of these, these kind of wrapping up of the estate. What we try to do is keep the paperwork to a minimum, and also to keep the paperwork between somebody and the bank or somebody in the investment company. We try to keep the paperwork from becoming a paperwork blizzard, if you will, by getting the probate court involved. And at the end of the day, if we have to do a little bit of probate on a couple of small accounts or a vehicle, that's really the win that you're looking for. The bulk of your assets pass by the named beneficiaries on IRAs, 401ks, things of that nature, and then your trust handles all of your taxable assets, and then that way your wishes are carried out. And then if the will has to come out of the envelope for a couple of small things, it's not heavy lifting, it's kind of small potato stuff. And that's the idea of transferring your assets through your trust. So as little, if anything, has to go through probate. But again, it's revocable. You're completely in control. While you're alive, you can do anything you want to do. Now, the other side of the coin, people ask us all the time is, Jay, I hear about this irrevocable trust. What's that all about? It seems a little bit more mysterious. I don't seem to understand, the differences and how it works. Well, first and foremost, the easy thing to take away from this concept or from this conversation is it's still a trust, which means all the things I talked about your ability to tell us who the beneficiaries are and to tell us where the assets are going to get directed and tell us that if something happened to you, where those assets would go, that's all the same. It's still a trust, and trust rules, or the way a trust would be used, is still at play. It's not dramatically different from that perspective. Here's the key difference. With an irrevocable trust, you are no longer in control. That's the difference, okay? With a revocable trust, you're completely in control. You can do whatever you want to do with the assets. You want to sell them, you want to buy them, you want to liquidate them, you want to go to Vegas, you want to go to Key West. It's a piece of cake. With an irrevocable trust, you are no longer in control. Now, I was trying to think of the concept and the best way to explain it, and I was remembering back when I was a younger man, and I have a younger sister who's somewhat younger than I am. And when I would get stuck as the babysitter back home, when there was nobody else around, and you know how kids respond to a babysitter or any type of older authority figure, especially if it's a sibling. So what we would try to do is tell her, hey, you're the younger sibling, this is what we want you to do. And her response, inevitably, when we asked her to do something was, you're not the boss of me. We've all heard it. Young kids use it all the time, right? Whenever they're responding to somebody who they know isn't in charge of them, you're not the boss of me. That's how you want to think about your irrevocable trust. Anything that you put into your irrevocable trust, you are no longer the boss of. You are not in charge. You're going to choose a different trustee that's not going to be you, okay? And just for argument's sake, we'll talk about real estate because it's the easiest thing to talk about. if you put a piece of real estate in your irrevocable trust, once you do that and you give that to somebody else and that person is the trustee, you now are no longer the boss of that property. You're no longer the boss of the Cape House. You're no longer the boss of your primary residence. You don't exercise any control. The trustee is now in control. That is the irrevocable trust concept in a nutshell. You now have no way to direct how those assets are treated or held. So for example, if you put a piece of property, we'll pick on the Cape House, you put the Cape House in the irrevocable trust. Now, a week after you do it, you realize, I may have made a mistake. I'm having a little bit of buyer's remorse, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. You go to the trustee and you say to the trustee, I made a mistake. I want you to give me back the Cape House. The trustee can say to you, that's a great idea. I'm not doing it. You don't have the ability to control what they now do with those assets. And it's that cutting of the string, it's that breaking of your ability to control things that's the primary reason for why people consider irrevocable trust planning. Why do we use real estate as an example? Well, you have to live somewhere. You have to have a roof over your head. And if you put a piece of real estate in your own irrevocable trust, in somebody else's name as the trustee, and what we usually see, it's the kids. You put the house in somebody else's name, now you don't have any control over it. It's your house. And for the most part, you don't really care because your day-to-day doesn't change. You wake up in the morning, you take sugar out of the same cabinet, you make coffee in the same coffee pot, you mow the same lawn, you cut the same bushes, you clean the same bathrooms. Nothing has really changed other than somewhere on a piece of paper it says, I don't own this house anymore, but your day-to-day is no different. So in many cases, you really don't notice that you've done it. And so for a lot of people, that's the easiest thing to wrap their head around. Now you can put money, you can put cash, you can put securities in an irrevocable trust that you are no longer in control of. But what a lot of folks do struggle with for a whole list of obvious reasons is it's a lot harder or it's a lot more difficult to part with a $300,000 portfolio or a $400,000 portfolio and place it out of your control into an irrevocable trust where you can't get any of it back. That gives people nightmares because they really recognize, what if I needed to get this money back? Jay just told me I'm not the boss of it anymore. What do I do? So we're always very tactical about the conversations that we have in terms of how these assets get redeployed and how these assets get retitled. Now, the concept of the irrevocable trust is that you cannot get the asset back. You can't pull it back to you. You can ask for it back, but you're not necessarily going to have any control over getting it back. But you can retain a little bit of control over some of the administrative provisions of the trust. And these are the kind of the boring things, right? You can change the trustee, all right? Now, why would you change the trustee? Well, families being family, there might be some type of breakdown in the family dynamic. You may have named child one the trustee, and for any number of reasons, issues come up, family being family, life being life. It may make sense at some point to change that trustee to another trustee. So you might make those changes. There's some other administrative provisions. It's nibbling around the edges. It's nothing glamorous that you can make some changes to. But the key component that you need to understand is you just cannot affect the ability for that property to come back to you. And at some point down the road, if you've done this with enough time, and the look-back period currently is 5 years, so this is what people are doing this for, if at some point down the road something happens, your trust may get some scrutiny. So we get this question all the time. Everybody says, Jay, I know it's irrevocable, but it's like kind of irrevocable, right? It's not really irrevocable. Well, we want people to go into this thinking it is irrevocable. We are doing something that we want to be considered permanent because at some point down the road, somebody may scrutinize this. And so this idea that, hey, can I pull 30 grand out to buy a car? You know, those things capture somebody's eye down the road, and then that may get some additional scrutiny that we may not want there to be additional scrutiny on. So the concept to go into this is, look, you don't want to impoverish yourself in an attempt to try to protect some money. We always try to focus our clients on that concept. Let's not put every single nickel we have in an attempt to try to beat something that may never happen, this trip to a nursing home or whatever the concern is. We want to strike a balance, right? So the thing to keep in mind is it's not an either-or proposition. You can have both. You can have a revocable trust for the assets that you want to keep, that you want to hang on to, that you want to control, and then you can have an irrevocable trust for the assets that you feel comfortably are things that you're not worried about. You think that those are considered what we call legacy assets. Those are assets that you really want to try to get to a loved one or to get to family members or whatever your objective is. But again, the concept, and this surprises a lot of people. We said, look, you can have both trusts. You can have sometimes people think it's one or the other. It's not one or the other. In many cases, it's both. So you target the assets that you think are extra assets. And again, I know it's hard to say who has extra assets, but you target things that you say, look, I think this is sort of we want to try to leave this as a legacy. We want to intentionally try to put something aside to leave as a legacy. Again, that's one of the reasons that we always start with real estate. It's kind of the easiest thing to start working with because obviously people get a little bit concerned about giving away liquid assets unless they're absolutely certain that they've got some liquid assets that may or may not, that they may not need down the road. And again, we would always caution, let's proceed very carefully here. Let's make sure that we're not trying to get rid of things, if you will. That's a real technical term. Get rid of things that we might need down the road. We might need to pull back down the road. Now, when does this type of planning come in? This type of planning, this idea of putting things into some type of irrevocable trust, we find works really well when you have a really good sense of what the lay of the land is, meaning you maybe have moved, you've maybe downsized, you've maybe kind of closed things down and you're consolidated things into either the Cape House or the Lake House or the Mountain Place, or you sort of know this place that we're in is our forever home. This is something that we might want to consider putting into the irrevocable trust. Again, the idea is to say, look, I want this off my plate so that if 5 years and a day go by, something happens and somebody were to take sick, if we thought that Medicaid was going to be our backstop for some of our long-term care costs, this concept of having this outside of that window means that that asset would then go to whoever you want it to go, whoever you have as the named beneficiary. So it works just like your revocable trust. They work the same. The trust rules are very, very similar, but the biggest difference is you can't unring that bell. You're not the boss of whatever you put into your irrevocable trust. So to bring things to a close, the focus on trust planning is to do a couple of things. It's to allow your assets to be controlled by you while you're alive. It's to allow your assets to be controlled by somebody that you've already named if for some reason you can't control your assets. And then it's also designed to make sure that if something were to happen to you, your assets can go from yourself, under your control, under your use, to somebody else, family members, loved ones, in the rules or the roles that you've set up for somebody. So again, if you have minor children, you can lay out the rules as to how do the kids get their money. If you have older children, you can lay out who gets what in what percentages, and then you can also look a little further down the org chart so that if something does happen and something happens to other members in the family, you can make provisions as to where your assets go. So remember, revocable, you are in control. Irrevocable, you are not in control. You have cut the string to the control of those assets. We're doing it because you're comfortable doing it. We're doing it because it's assets that you're relatively certain you can kind of push off the table with the idea or the hope that you're not going to need these down the road, recognizing that life changes. When we put these trusts together for people, we build in a real degree of flexibility around them so that if something does need to change down the road, the best thing you can do is sit down with your attorney, sit down with your advisor, and talk about it and let them guide you as to what the best way to tweak or change the plan that you have in place as it's put in place and what needs to be changed moving forward. So again, Jay Marsden with There's a Will. If there's a will, there's a way. We appreciate you watching. Stay tuned for future episodes, and if you have any questions, reach out to us at the firm or reach out to us at jmarsdenlaw.com. Thank you very much. Have a great night.